Hello, so this is another video for my Native Studies class. The article I chose to do was on the First Nations fracking of like the oil sands and things, kind of like peaceful protests and standoff. So the article is titled Canada, Aboriginal Tension Erupting Over Resource Development, Study Suggests, and this is by Sunny Freeman. It's from the Huffington Post, so it's kind of like a not as well known news operation, I suppose. But essentially, the article it was biased, like it was opinionated, and it was just talking about how the companies weren't actually prepared properly to handle First Nations and their opinions on it. So I've kind of just got some of the background notes from the article that I took like last time. So kind of who does this article really mention? It really talks about there's a couple specific companies, namely Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline, Apache / Chevron / EOG, Pacific Trails Pipeline, Murphy Oil's Alberta Bakken project, and then so the First Nations that were actually the issues, because this oil sands all throughout Canada typically, and I guess the most popularly known one is the one in Alberta, because that's where the most oil sands are, but the First Nations that were mentioned within this particular article were the ones in the north, in the northern provinces, and as well as the eastern and western coast, so like New Brunswick and Alberta were mentioned. So like I said, this mostly focuses on New Brunswick and Alberta, but also talks about northern Canada. So this article is actually a little dated. It's from October 31st, so this issue has actually started in like late-ish October, and it's still occurring now. It hasn't been talked about very much now because there hasn't been many advances. So the reason why this article is mentioned, this article really just focuses on how companies aren't prepared to handle First Nations oil fracking, environmental issues. And so this is what the First Nations are doing to kind of fight back against these companies with peaceful protesting, as far as that goes, is preventing the companies from actually proceeding with the projects to actually take over. Like these big pipeline companies can't actually go in and work on the oil sands because these natives are kind of standing off and like blocking them off, blockading them. Essentially, that's kind of what the fracking is, if you didn't know that. So the issue that this article focuses on, I really like it because, like, I mean, of course, there's the issues throughout, like the environmental issues, but this article actually talked about the overlying issue, and that's that. As of right now, the clashing is bad, but the clashing between the companies and the First Nations will only increase as resources are becoming more scarce and companies are trying to find new ones fast. And First Nations people increasingly see their rights upheld at national and international levels. And that was something really interesting I found within this article. Is it actually says First Nations have been on a winning streak with nearly 200 court cases recognizing their right to be consulted about the fracking and resource issues. So it's good that they're winning these cases, but at the time I also find it really sad and just kind of awful at the fact that like these cases are only so that the First Nations are actually being talked to about it and being recognized as their right to be consulted. So it's not even actually like their right to actually have an like say no and then oh well you can't do it because First Nations and it's their land that the oil sands are slowly working their way towards taking over. It's just the fact that they win the right to be there to talk, which is kind of sad. I mean, really, that's it. It's sad in a way that that's what they consider a win, and that's what everybody is considering wins, because that really is just a basic right, and it shouldn't actually be considered a win to me personally. So there's 16 companies and 76 projects in Canada out of the 52 American companies and 370 projects worldwide involving oil sands. So Canada is home to 6 of the 21 projects considered to be the highest risk of collapsing. That's serious. Here's an interesting fact that I found. People believe that Canada is operating like a third world country. Somebody actually said, Adamson, who's just, I guess, a social activist who was interviewing these First Nations and whatnot, and then was being interviewed by the Huffington Post, which in a way it kind of is because this is in regards to how they're treating the First Nations about these tar sands. Here's the interesting part though. A company from New Brunswick, Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline, actually said that their blockades, like their daily blockades, have cost as much as $60,000 per day in New Brunswick alone. Like, that's an incredible amount of money just for blockades, when really you could just have discussions and figure out different places to find oil, or even just, I think the biggest issue is that the fact that everybody's just trying to get these last little bits of oil, and tar sands are the dirtiest forms of oil possible because you have to extract them, and there's just all these huge environmental issues, instead of actually people putting their time and money into finding new, better sources of power and then changing it, because eventually oil is going to run out, and at that time, as it's going right now, nobody's going to know what to do. So I feel like this is, of course, the reason why I chose this article for Native Studies is because it really talks about natives, and it's not even just like the First Nations from one specific spot. It's from East Coast to West Coast to Northern Canada, and so it's like impacting everywhere in Canada, essentially, or almost everywhere. And I feel like what the natives can do right now is what they're doing is continue peaceful protesting, trying not to provoke the companies too much, just keep having court cases and trying like that. And I think the companies can start thinking of other places to try to find oil, or other ways and other methods of, I guess, energy that'll be healthier. And I feel like the possible outcomes for this are going to be that the companies are just going to get mad and are going to do something they'll regret, and they're going to take over, and then the First Nations will stop being heard. Or I think another outcome is First Nations will be heard, the government will kind of switch its plan. I mean, I'm thinking that won't be the outcome because Stephen Harper is really pro-oil and pro-business and all that jive, but pardon me, I think it is great that First Nations are getting a lot more court cases and winning, and I think it's good that they actually do have to be consulted, because it is their right, and I think they should have been consulted from the start. But another thing I found this article is interesting for was that it was actually, it says in the article, I'll post a link to the article, that it talks about how companies operating in Canada have no clear regulatory guidelines for how to deal with Aboriginal communities, creating an uncertain business climate. Well, if you're going to go and you're going to try to make these companies on reserves, or just pushing into reserves, or making the environment around reserves or in reserves worse or unhealthy, I think you should definitely have a plan on how to tell people that, or work with people to make the costs and keep the environment as safe as possible, and like make the cost as low as possible. So I feel like they should have really made a business plan, and the fact that these companies are supposed to be companies that we should trust, and like we're trusting them to handle our fuel, our future fuel, and they can't even think about a business plan before working with like a client, almost, you could say. So as of now, I'm probably gonna keep an ear out for this. I'm not gonna follow as well as my I'm following along the educational issue that I talked about in the previous video. But yeah, I wonder what you guys think about the fracking, and it's been going on for about a month now, and it hasn't really had that much publicity since it started, and I really don't think it's going to get much more publicity until something big happens, or until it's over. What I know now, nobody's been like hurt, or like no casualties, I guess is the word. So that's good, I suppose, but I'm just hoping that the businesses will kind of sit together, and the companies will all talk together and maybe actually figure out a plan on how to handle First Nations. I shouldn't really say deal with them, because I don't think that's the term that should be used. So yeah, I believe that's everything for my video. Like I said, I'll post a link below. Okay.